Homeless cowboy took in a snow-covered girl. Her story made the saloon go silent. The wind slashed through Jake Connelly like a knife of ice. But it wasn't just the cold that cut him. It was memory. For 3 endless days the storm had raged across the Colorado mountains, burying the world in a blinding sheet of white. Snow piled so deep a man could vanish within arm's reach of his own fire. His horse, a weary bay mare named Belle, fought her way through the drifts, steam rising with every labored breath. Jake hunched into his battered leather coat, the same one he'd worn for 5 winters, though its warmth had long since bled away. He should never have been up here this late in the season. Any man with sense had already gone down to the valleys weeks ago, chasing shelter and heat before the first heavy snow fell. But Jake had not been a man of sense for a long time. Not since fever stole his little Sarah from the world. Not since Mary, his Mary, packed up what was left of her heart and left him behind. Since then, Jake had been drifting like a ghost, trading sweat for beans and bacon, living more under the stars than under any roof. The storm had caught him high in the meadows, on his way back from a cattle job that paid in scraps. He tried to push through, praying to reach Rabbit Creek's trading post before the snow sealed the world shut. But the trail had vanished beneath the white, and now he rode blind, letting Belle's instincts guide them. That was when he saw it. At first it was only a shadow in the snow, a dark shape that looked wrong against the endless white. Too small, too still. His pulse quickened as Belle drew closer, and dread clawed at him. It wasn't a branch. It wasn't a stone. Jake slid from the saddle, snow swallowing him to the knees. The cold tore at his face, but he pushed forward until he reached the shape. His heart froze. It was a child. A little girl, curled as if asleep. Her black hair spilled across the snow like spilled ink. Her lips were blue, her skin pale as wax. Jake's hands trembled as he brushed the frost from her cheek. She was alive, but only just. The shallow flutter of breath against the silence was so faint it nearly broke him. She couldn't have been more than 7, maybe 8. And she was dressed in nothing more than rags fit for autumn. No match for this deadly winter. "Hey, little one," Jake whispered, his voice raw from days of silence. But she did not stir. He looked around, desperate for answers, and saw the wagon. Not far away, a massive pine had come crashing down, splintering the wagon beneath it, its load scattered half-buried in snow. And beneath the wreckage, 2 figures lay still. A man. A woman. The man's hands were rough with work, his hair silvered with age. The woman bore the same black hair as the girl. Family. Parents. And they were gone. Jake stood there in the storm, staring at the ruin of a life cut short. He had seen death before, but it never grew easier. And when children were left behind, it was a wound that never closed. He stumbled back to the girl. She needed warmth, or she'd soon join her parents in the silence beyond. Jake stripped off his coat, pulled the thin blanket from Belle, and wrapped her in both. She was light as a bird when he lifted her, her head lolling against his shoulder. Still breathing, still clinging. He climbed into the saddle and held her tight against him, willing his body heat into hers. "Come on, little one," he murmured. "Stay with me. We're going to make it." Belle plodded forward through the storm, and Jake began talking to the child, though she could not hear him. He told her of Rabbit Creek, of Martha Gillis and her warm fire, her soft heart beneath her iron shell. He painted pictures of soup, of blankets, of safety. He did not speak of her parents. Not yet. Not until she was stronger. But as he held her, the memory of another child rose to choke him. Sarah. His Sarah. She would have been this age now. He saw her smile, heard her laughter, felt again the crushing weight of that fevered silence. He remembered riding too late, arriving just in time to carve her cross. He remembered Mary's eyes, silent with blame she never spoke. Silence that had driven her away. The guilt cut deeper than the cold ever could. Jake closed his eyes against the storm, against the memories. Not now. Not with this girl depending on him. He whispered a promise into her dark hair, the same promise he had whispered at Sarah's grave. "I won't let you die. Not you." Not this time. The storm was easing now. Through the trees ahead, the valley opened wide, and Belle's pace quickened. Jake looked down at the fragile child in his arms, her lips still blue but breathing steady, and for the first time in years, a spark of something stirred inside him. Hope, and with it, a reason to keep riding. Red Creek was barely a town at all, just a scatter of tired buildings clinging to the frozen banks of a muddy creek. It was the kind of place men drifted to when they wanted to vanish, where no one asked questions and everyone carried ghosts. The only saloon belonged to Martha Gillis, a woman forged harder than the land itself. She had buried her tenderness long ago, learning that kindness was a luxury the mountains never spared. But the night Jake Connelly pushed through her batwing doors, carrying a bundle that breathed faintly beneath his coat, the saloon fell silent as a churchyard. The men looked up from their whiskey, from their cards, from the lives they were wasting away. Snow clung to Jake's shoulders, melting into rivers down his coat. His face was gray with exhaustion, hollow with cold, and in his arms, wrapped in every scrap of cloth he owned, was the fragile shape of a child. Her pale face peeked through the folds, lips still tinged blue. "Sweet Lord," whispered old Pete Morrison, his whiskey glass frozen halfway to his mouth. "Alive?" Jake rasped. His voice cracked from storm and silence. "Barely." Martha's boots thudded against the wood as she stepped out from behind the bar. Broad-shouldered, iron-gray hair knotted back. Her eyes had long ago turned sharp from too many years seeing men at their worst. Yet when she looked at the girl, something shifted, just enough for mercy to shine through. "Bring her," she said. "By the fire." Now, the room erupted into motion. Men who had forgotten gentleness found it again in the urgency of her command. A table was cleared, blankets fetched, and soon Jake laid the child down beside the stove's glow. Her chest rose in shallow, stubborn breaths. "Tree crushed her folks' wagon," Jake muttered. His voice weighted with sorrow. Martha only nodded. Winter claimed families every year, hopeful travelers who learned too late that snow did not bargain. She returned with warm milk and a cloth, showing Jake how to feed a child too weak to swallow. He followed her instructions with a patience that surprised even him, dipping the cloth, brushing it against the girl's lips, waiting as drops of milk coaxed life back into her. Around them, hardened men watched in silence. Cowboys, drifters, prospectors, all carrying sins and regrets. Yet as they watched Jake care for the girl, something long buried stirred within them. Memories of children they'd lost, of fathers they'd loved, of lives that might have been. "Her name?" asked Carson quietly, his scarred hands resting on the table edge. Jake shook his head, eyes never leaving her face. "She hasn't spoken." 3 days passed before the girl's eyes fluttered open. Dark eyes, wide and knowing, far too old for her years. She did not speak. She only watched Jake, silent as snowfall, as though weighing the measure of the man who had carried her out of death's grip. Martha gave them the storage room behind her kitchen. A narrow bed, a washstand, a window that faced the frozen creek. Jake took the floor, letting the girl rest on the mattress. Each morning he woke to find her sitting upright, silent, watching him with eyes that carried both fear and trust. Doc Henley, who knew more about whiskey and wounds than children, examined her and declared she would recover. "She'll talk when she's ready," he said. "Sometimes the world shouts too loud, and a soul has to go quiet to survive." Jake took work at the stables, trading his strength for a few dollars and the chance to keep her fed. Each evening he returned with something for her. A ribbon, a toy carved from wood, a small dress bought secondhand. He went hungry so she could eat. He wore worn-out boots so she could walk in new ones. The men of Red Creek watched, their rough edges softened by the sight. They saw a broken cowboy give everything to a child who wasn't his, mending her clothes with clumsy fingers, brushing her hair with patience that looked like love. "Unnatural," Pete muttered one night, though admiration laced his voice. "Maybe," Carson said, "but maybe the best things are." Even Martha felt the thaw. She had sworn her heart to stone when influenza stole her children and the bottle stole her husband. Yet as she watched Jake, as she heard the girl's quiet footsteps following him through the saloon, she felt something stir she thought had died forever. One night, as Jake tucked the girl into bed, her small hand reached for his. For the first time, she gave instead of only receiving. Her warm fingers curled around his weathered hand, and she held on as though she'd found her anchor. Jake whispered the same words he had every night, though they now felt different, heavier, more sacred. "Good night, little one." She did not answer. She only held on. And as snow fell soft outside the window, Jake realized that both of them, cowboy and child, had gone silent once upon a time when the world had shouted too loud. But here, in this tiny room above a frozen creek, perhaps silence could give way to something else. Perhaps it could give way to hope. March drifted into Red Creek like a quiet secret, softening the edges of winter with sunlight that glimmered on melting ice. Jake's days had fallen into rhythm. Long hours at the livery, the smell of hay and horses clinging to him, the ache in his muscles proof that he was alive and working again. 6 weeks had passed, and in all that time, the little girl had been at his side like a shadow. She followed him everywhere, silent but constant, her presence both heavy and strangely comforting. Yet not once had her voice broken the air between them. That morning, while brushing down Belle's coat, Jake hummed without thinking. An old tune Mary used to sing in their kitchen back in Durango. The melody rose from his chest like a memory too tender to stay buried. He was lost in it, the rhythm of brush and song carrying him someplace far away, when suddenly a sound pierced the air. A child's voice, fragile but clear. "My mama used to sing that song." The brush froze in his hand. Jake turned slowly, afraid the moment would vanish if he moved too quick. The girl stood there, no longer wrapped in silence. Her eyes shimmered with tears, but there was relief too, as though she had been holding her breath for weeks and had finally let it out. Jake swallowed hard. Did she sing it often?" The girl nodded, her voice steadier this time. "Every morning when she made breakfast. Papa said it was the prettiest sound in the whole world." For 6 weeks she had been a mystery, a ghost in his care, but now she was flesh and voice and story. "What's your name, little one?" he asked. She straightened, as if remembering who she was. "Emma Catherine Morrison. I'm 7 years old, and I was born in Missouri, on Christmas morning." The name cracked something open in Jake's chest. "Emma," he repeated softly, like the word itself could thaw the frozen parts of him. Emma stepped closer, her hand brushing Belle's warm neck. Then, slowly, she began to speak. She told him about Missouri, about the farm they'd left behind, the bad crop that had stripped their hope, her father's dream of California where the sun always shone and the land promised life. Her voice carried the weight of memory, fragile at first, then spilling out as though a dam had finally broken. When she spoke of the storm, her voice grew smaller. The wind, the trees bending, her father fighting to keep them on the trail. Jake knelt beside her, grounding her. "You don't have to tell it all at once," he said gently. But Emma shook her head. "I want to. I've been keeping it inside, and it hurts too much to keep it there." So he listened as she told of the falling tree, her mother's arms shielding her, the silence that followed. How she woke under the wagon, alive but surrounded by death. How she spent 2 days speaking to her parents, telling them stories about California, hoping her voice would bring them back. Jake's vision blurred with tears. He reached for her hands, warm now, no longer frozen. "You did everything right," he whispered. "You loved them with all you had. That's more than enough." When Emma lifted her gaze, Jake saw it. The same sorrow he carried, the same hollow ache that had driven him to whiskey, to wandering, to Red Creek. "Tell me about your little girl," she said softly. "The one in your dreams." Jake froze. He hadn't known she heard. But Emma's eyes told him she had been carrying his pain too, in silence. "Her name was Sarah," he began, his voice rough. "She was 6 when she died, just about your age. Yellow curls, always asking questions. Why the sky was blue, why horses had 4 legs, why grown-ups forgot how to laugh." His lips trembled as he spoke. She had a laugh like church bells, and she used to follow me everywhere, trying to help with chores too big for her hands. Then the fever came. I rode for days to get home, but I was too late. His chest tightened. Mary, my wife, blamed me. Maybe she was right. I was gone too much, trying to build a future and missing the family I already had. She left not long after. And he stopped, his breath heavy. I didn't know how to live anymore. Didn't know how to wake up, or how to look at other children without breaking. Emma didn't speak. She simply placed her small hand in his, anchoring him through the storm of memory. So they sat there in the hay, two broken souls weaving their grief together until it felt like rope, stronger for the binding. Outside, the snow melted in steady drips, the sound of a world moving forward whether they wanted it to or not. "I'm glad you found me," Emma whispered after a long pause. "When I wanted to disappear." Jake tightened his grip on her hand. "I'm glad too. Maybe we both needed finding." She leaned against his shoulder, and for the first time in years, Jake felt the weight of trust. Fragile, heavy, and sacred. "What happens now?" Emma asked. Jake looked out at Red Creek, the muddy street, the saloon, the livery where work gave his days shape, the small room where Emma slept warm and safe. He thought of Martha, of the quiet nods of townsfolk who were beginning to see him as more than a drifter. "I don't know," he said truthfully, "but maybe we figure it out together." That afternoon, they shared more stories. Emma about California dreams, Jake about the joy of Sarah before loss hollowed him out. Their voices turned memory into survival, sorrow into connection. By supper, when Martha called them in, they walked side by side, no longer strangers tied by chance, but something else, something like family. At the saloon door, Emma looked up, her eyes shining with both sorrow and a fragile hope. "Do you think," she asked carefully, "that maybe home isn't a place you go to, but something you build with the people who stay with you?" Jake's heart cracked open again. But this time, not from breaking. This time to let something new take root. Spring came to Colorado like a vow fulfilled, as if the land itself had been waiting for this moment of release. Snowmelt raced down the mountainsides, silver streams weaving through the valleys, their voices singing the hymn of winter's end. The earth softened, drinking greedily, and soon the first spears of green pushed through the brown crust of soil. The air smelled of pine sap, fresh grass, and something more elusive, possibility. For months, Jake had lived with only forward motion in his heart. Every coin he earned mucking stalls at the livery or hammering repairs on wagons, every nickel saved from long hours of backbreaking labor, was tucked away. He had traded sweat for scraps, exhaustion for hot meals, and pride for survival. But behind every choice was a single purpose: Emma. She deserved walls that belonged to her, ground that couldn't be taken away by chance or cruelty. She deserved roots. By April, Jake walked into Henry Patterson's store with calloused hands, weary shoulders, and enough money to make an offer. The land wasn't much. 20 rocky acres just outside Red Creek, dotted with stubborn pine and young aspen, crowned by a weathered two-room cabin that bore the scars of abandonment. Yet when Jake set eyes on it, something old and heavy inside him shifted. For years he had drifted like a man exiled from himself. Here, against the backdrop of mountains catching the morning light, he felt the faint tug of belonging. The cabin sagged in places, its windows broken-eyed, its roof patched and patched again until it looked more quilt than shelter. But its bones were strong. Some homesteader had carved his dreams into those squared logs with patient hands, then surrendered to defeat and left. Jake ran his palm across the wood, felt the echo of someone else's hopes, and knew he was ready to carve his own. He signed the deed with a borrowed pen that shook slightly in his hand. Emma stood beside him, clutching Pete Morrison's carved wooden horse, her gaze steady on him as though she understood that ink on paper could stitch their fates together. When Patterson slid the paper across the counter, Jake felt the weight of it. Ownership, permanence, something no storm or sorrow could rip away. "It's ours," he whispered as they left town in Frank Washburn's wagon, their few possessions rattling in the back. "Really ours." Emma only nodded, holding the horse tighter. She had been talking more since her silence had first broken in the stable months earlier. Small words at first, then full sentences, sometimes even laughter, but she still drifted into quiet spells. Jake had come to understand that silence was no longer absence. It was her way of checking that her voice remained hers to keep. The cabin smelled of dust, old smoke, and lives long gone. Jake swept while Emma explored, her steps light on the creaking floorboards. The larger room held a stone fireplace, blackened but sturdy. The smaller room, with its east-facing window, offered just enough space for a narrow bed. Jake told Emma it could be hers, but she shook her head firmly. "I want the big room," she said, "so we can both be by the fire when it gets cold again." So they spread Jake's worn bedroll near the hearth, and beside it placed the small bed Jake had bartered 3 weeks of wages to buy. Emma insisted it be by the window so she could watch the stars. It wasn't much, but when Jake lit the first fire that evening, shadows danced across the walls and turned the humble cabin into something close to holy. He made beans and cornbread for supper, Emma's favorite since Martha first fed her in the saloon kitchen. They ate on the porch steps, the sky ablaze with sunset over the peaks. The same mountains where Jake had once found her half-frozen now seemed softened, no longer menacing but forgiving, like old adversaries weary of battle. Emma ate slowly, her fork pausing as if weighing thoughts too big for her small frame. The meadowlark's song floated across the clearing, and Jake felt a peace he hadn't known in years, a sense of finally arriving at the place his wandering soul had been searching for. "You're quiet tonight," he said, nudging her shoulder. Emma set her fork down and stared at the purpled ridgelines. "I've been thinking about my mama and papa, how they'd feel about me being here with you instead of in California like we planned." Jake's heart squeezed. Nights of restless worry had gnawed at him with that same question. Was he stealing something that belonged to ghosts? Could the broken cowboy ever be enough for the daughter of another man? "What do you think they'd say?" His voice was barely a whisper. Emma's eyes glistened in the fading light. She thought for a long time, then said softly, "I think they'd say I was lucky. That even when the worst thing happened, someone good found me." Her gaze met his, steady as a vow. "I remember my mama's face now," she said, her voice strong. "She smiled when she sang, and she smelled like flower and lavender. I remember my papa lifting me on his shoulders at the fair. His laugh was so loud it made everybody laugh too." Jake swallowed hard, afraid to break the fragile magic of her remembering. "But when I think about home," Emma continued, "I don't see Missouri. I don't see California. I see this. I see you. I see Martha's kitchen. I see Belle and the way you hum when you brush her." The words landed in Jake's chest like both a wound and a healing. This child, pulled from snow and sorrow, had chosen him. A man once broken by grief now stood as the keeper of her hope. "Emma," he rasped, "you sure about that? You sure you want to stay here with me?" Her nod was certain, her voice unwavering. "I'm sure. You saved me, Jake. Not just from the cold. From being alone inside all that hurt. You showed me how to carry it without letting it break me." Jake pulled her into his arms, holding on as if she anchored him to the earth. The ice around his heart melted fully at last, replaced by something fierce and unyielding. Love not borrowed from the past but rooted in the present. That night, beneath a sky jeweled with stars, Jake slept without ghosts. No Sarah's grave haunting him. No Mary's bitter tears. No emptiness echoing through rooms he'd abandoned. Instead, he dreamed of Emma laughing as she planted beans in the garden, of evenings by the fire, of a future stitched together with ordinary miracles. At dawn, he woke to the sound of Emma humming as she scrambled eggs over the fire. Sunlight filtered through the window, gilding her hair, and Jake knew something had shifted inside him. The guilt he had carried for years, an iron chain of loss, had loosened. He could not bring Sarah back, nor repair the life that had unraveled before Red Creek. But he could love Emma with everything left in him. And maybe that was redemption enough. Back in town, word of Jake's new beginning spread across Martha's breakfast tables. Carson mentioned seeing Frank's wagon carrying their few belongings up the ridge. Good for them, Martha said, pouring coffee. That child needs more than borrowed rooms. Funny, Pete Morrison added, turning his mug in his hands. Never thought I'd see the day Jake Connelly planted roots. Man was running hard when he rode in here. Doc Henley folded his paper. Sometimes a man just needs a reason to stop running. Martha said nothing for a while, wiping the bar. She had seen too many men drown their hurt in whiskey, too many promises burned to ash. But Jake had been different. When the child needed him, he had stood. Sometimes the only way to save yourself, she murmured, is to save someone else first. And so the days in Red Creek unfolded like new leaves. The creek swelled with snowmelt, cottonwoods budded with green, and townsfolk nodded knowingly when they glimpsed smoke rising steady from the chimney on the ridge. Up at the cabin, life settled into rhythm. Jake mended fences, patched the roof, and carved a garden into the stubborn earth. Emma collected wildflowers and arranged them in jars, humming softly as she worked. Nights were filled with the crackle of firewood, stories traded back and forth, and silence that was no longer empty but full of trust, of belonging, of home. They had both lost families they could never reclaim, but together they built something new. And sometimes, when Emma laughed or when Jake caught himself humming the same lullaby Sarah once loved, it felt less like replacement and more like grace. Because some homes are inherited, and others are chosen. And the best ones are forged in the fire of loss, tempered by love, and kept alive by the courage to begin again. On the ridge above Red Creek, a cowboy and a little girl learned what it meant to be family. Not by blood, but by the fierce choice to stand together. And in the rising smoke of their hearth, the town could see proof of an old truth. So that's the story for today. If you enjoyed this, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories. On a scale of 10 to 0, how would you rate this story? And let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to know. We'll see you in the next video. Until then, stay happy and take care.